I'm going to give it to Mark, who's going to start. Mark Barolo from UST.
So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from. Again, this is Mark Barolo from UST. I just wanted to take a second to help kick this off, but wanted to first thank all of you for taking the time today to come and listen to the group talk through the various changes. As I think you are all familiar, the EPA published new regulations several years ago. You all have been working feverishly to modify your regulations, but that means there are new requirements in place for tank owners, or there will be shortly. And so we had to take a fresh look at the performance measures to update those to make sure they incorporate all the new requirements, or at least the requirements that we decided we wanted to capture through a performance measure. So folks here at EPA joined with the SWOMO and a whole work group of folks to look through the existing measures, make modifications to those, make some additions, also subtract some of the old measures. And so now there's going to be a new suite of performance measures, and there we'll also talk about sort of the way that's going to roll out timing-wise, depending on when states incorporate their own regulations. And I want to, I think a lot of the folks are on the call today, but a special thank you to those of you who were part of this work group and put in a lot of time over the last couple of years to get this done and came up with a good product and put together the webinar to help educate everyone about it. So I was going to let Leslie talk a little bit about, the role that SWOMO had as part of this, but just mostly want to say thanks to those who were involved and look forward to hearing from various members of the group here now and the various states talking through the provisions as we go through the webinar today. So Leslie, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. I'm glad everyone was able to join us today. It looks like we have great attendance. And for those of you who don't know, I'm currently the tank subcommittee chair. This will be my last year, so I'm enjoying the last few things I get to do with the SWOMO. But just wanted to give you guys a little bit of startup from about 3 to 4 years ago. A SWOMO started talking about what we were going to do with compliance measures and SOC once the new regulations had passed. And the tank subcommittee decided at that time we would work on getting a group together, work group that would work with UST to come up with these new measures. And we asked for volunteers for about 2 years, trying to get people who we finally wrangled in, people from I believe, almost all of the regions. May have been one or two that said they couldn't participate, but for the most part, representatives from most of the regions. And we started, and we've been working for about a year, maybe a little over a year on this, and really think we've come up with a good product. I want to thank everybody who has volunteered your time and done so much work on this. And I will now turn it over to Liz so that we can discuss what these final measures have come out to be.
Thank you very much, Leslie. So before we get too deep into the compliance measures, I just want to touch on a few changes that we made to the non-compliance measures. So Charles, can you forward the slide to 3? So we made a couple of changes to the universe measures. So as you know, previously deferred tanks are no longer previously deferred tanks. There are a number of our deferred tanks that are now included in the universe of measures. For example, emergency generator tanks have to have release detection now. So we needed to make some changes there. So in addition, we added a new measure on hazardous substance tanks. So the way we figure out our number of active petroleum tanks, we actually do some subtracting of different measures. We didn't have a closed hazardous substance tanks measure, so we couldn't do that calculation and figure out our active number. So we're adding in that closed hazardous substance tanks measure, so now we can actually have an accurate number of active hazardous substance tanks. We are getting rid of two measures that we have collected in the past. So you'll recall with the passage of the Energy Policy Act, we started collecting delivery prohibition measure, and that is actually the only enforcement measure that we collected. So now that we really have a handle on how delivery prohibition is going in different states, we know how they're using it. Some are using it differently than others, but we have a good handle on what's happening, so we don't really feel like we need that measure reported anymore. Now, of course, your states and regions will still want to discuss it, and you'll share information with your region about it, but that's no longer going to be an official measure. The emergency response measure was always kind of a hot mess, so we weren't really able to use it, so we're no longer going to collect that. We never really could come to consensus on exactly what that was. So we didn't change any of the corrective action measures. Those are actually all going to remain the same. So now we'll talk a little bit about when you actually have to begin reporting. Mark touched on this. So your state will begin reporting on the new measures once you've implemented your new regulations. So not just once they've passed, but once they actually are implemented. So until that time, you'll continue reporting on significant operational compliance. But once you've implemented your regs and you begin reporting on the new compliance regs, which technical compliance rate we'll talk more about, but that's going to be the new combined measure. Once you switch over to that, you no longer will report on SOC. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's going to happen, and Sue is working feverishly to update LUS 4, so that will all be easy for you to do. So I mentioned TCR, the technical compliance rate. What is that, and how does it compare to our old SOC? So SOC, or significant operational compliance, has three measures. There's a release prevention measure, a release detection measure, and then a combined measure that includes both release prevention and release detection. So TCR is similar because it still has release prevention and release detection and a combined measure. But it's different because we've actually broken the release prevention into three separate measures, which Matt will talk a little bit more in detail about in a few minutes. And then we've also added testing and other aspects of the 2015 regulations into the measures as appropriate. So what are the measures that are part of TCR? Charles, can you go to the next slide? So as I said, there are the release prevention measures and the release detection measures. So it's spill prevention, overfill prevention, corrosion prevention, and then release detection. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt Jones from New Hampshire, who is going to talk more in detail about the release prevention measures.
Thanks, Liz. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Happy to have a good turnout for this. Jumping into the spill prevention, and with all three of these prevention measures, there's similarities and then there's added new differences. So the similarity with the spill prevention one is really spill prevention devices. It's present and functional. So you have a spill bucket. Is there damage to the spill bucket, holes, cracks, what have you? In the inspector's judgment, does it actually contain spills if there's a delivery happening to or when it's disconnected from the fill pipe? The new piece is going to be B, which is testing 3 years or periodically monitoring. So has it been tested in the last 3 years, and did it pass that test? If the test actually failed, was the bucket repaired, retested, and passed, or was it a brand new bucket that was installed? And according to a code of practice. Records really should be 3 years. It should exist for 3 years and should have those readily available. And as far as the documentation for the double wall buckets, you're really looking at to show that periodic monitoring. You want to make sure that they have monthly records. So every 30 days, you need to have record that they've checked the integrity of both walls. And that is in lieu of testing every 3 years. And the other key piece is the records have to be maintained for as long as they're using that, the bucket or the containment sump is using that periodic monitoring. Charles, can you go to the next slide? Moving on to overfill, again, similarities. You're looking at part A is going to the device is present and operational. So what device do you guys have? Is it a flapper valve? Is it audible alarm overfill device is a ball float. Are those set at the correct levels? Do you have installation records, contractor verification, field observation at the time of inspection? For the flappers, is there a stick going down the drop tube that's maybe a clamp that's on the drop tube that is not allowing it to shut off at a proper level? Is really looking down that fill pipe to make sure that there's visual observation that the flapper valve is there. For your high levels, audible, visual, or visible at 90%, of course, testing the alarm to make sure that it is functional. Can the driver see the alarm, hear the alarm at the point of transfer? And finally, with the ball floats, 90%, of course, or 30 minutes before being overfilled. Having those records again of observation or from the contractor that it is present. Another small piece to this is any accessible fittings, which would be such things as drain mechanisms and spill buckets. Are those sealed intact at the top so that the tank is tight at the top? And key piece, making sure that appropriate device is being used. Example being coaxial drop tubes for a stage 1 vapor recovery. It's not going to work with a ball float. Finally, the big key piece to change here is that the ball floats, if it can't be repaired, you can't replace with the ball float. So you have to put in a flapper valve automatic shut-off device or put in that high-level audible or visible alarm. The new piece here for the overfills is the testing or inspection every 3 years. Has it been inspected within the last 3 years? If it did fail, was it repaired, retested, and passed, or was it replaced with the same device and a different device using a code of practice? And again, ball float can't be replaced with another ball float. And the records should be kept for the last 3 years, should be there at the time of inspection. You can go on to the next, Charles. Finally, corrosion protection. The key piece here really aren't any of the tanks, piping, fittings, any metal components, flex connectors, things like that, are they in contact with the ground? So that they would need that protection. Are they isolated from the ground? Part B is going to be 6 months within repair. Has it been tested within that 6 months? Can you go on to the next slide, Charles? C is going to be operation and maintenance. Do you have that continuous protection depending on the system? And UST, as far as the system goes, as far as the rectifier, when you're specifically looking at that piece, has it been inspected every 6 days? Do they have those records? Has it been tested overall as far as the maintenance and operation? Has it been tested within 3 years or in the last 3 years for that piece? If you have non-passing results, has it been repaired, promptly investigated to see if there was a release, what have you? Last piece is for line tanks. Anybody who's going to have a line tank, has it been inspected in a timely manner, which would be 10 years after installation or every 5 years after that? Has been inspected using a procedure by the implementing agency. And as far as the internal lining inspection, if it did pass, or if it passed, it's good. If it didn't pass, was one of the following done? Was the lining repaired? Was a new CP system installed, or was the tank permanently closed? And the key piece, the new piece here, is if you can't repair it, the tank does need to be permanently closed. That's it for me. I'll hand it back over to Liz.
Thank you, Matt, for all that information on the release prevention measures. Now, Tim Smith from OUST is going to tell us more about the changes we've made to the release detection measure.
Hello, everyone. This is Tim. The release detection requirements, they remain pretty much the same as SOC. There are some changes based on the new requirements. I wanted to state that the helpful information that Matt provided and some that I'll provide to you, they're covered in the inspector's guide. It's an accompanying document for the TCR. Take a little time to get used to that. I'm so used to SOC. I've been calling it TRC for a while. But the TCR measures, this first element for release detection, that is basically equipped to comply. Is it operating properly from a visual inspection standpoint? No alarms going off. Specific performance requirements, those standards, they've been met. The 0.5 or the 0.2 gallon per hour leak detection, a lot of these are Is it an approved, if you will, or listed method on the leak detection work group's list? We have some new equipment like continuous in-tank leak detection systems that will require a little bit more checking to make sure they're appropriate or they meet the performance requirements. But the other equipment like ATGs, they're out there. We're all familiar with those. But in that inspector's guide, we do stress, and we talk a number of places that the requirements for like emergency generator tanks or switching from the automatic or the line leak detector tests for pressurized piping, it's really dependent on the compliance date established by the implementing agency, and it varies by state. So it's very important, something that will take a little time to go through in this measure to ensure that based on your state's requirements for secondary containment specifically, it's one of the key here where some of the older release detection methods are not acceptable for use after a certain date based on your secondary containment date. So there's going to be a lot of switch out just because they're using and you required in 2010 that secondary containment with interstitial monitoring was in place doesn't necessarily mean that the facility, if they installed it in 2011, they might not meet that requirement. So definitely making sure that they are using interstitial monitoring after your secondary containment date is going to be a biggie. Element B, well, that last part, let me go back to A. That last part has been periodically tested for proper operation. That's actually covered in element C. We're going to be striking through that, updating our information on our website. But that is covered under a different element. As far as element B is concerned, the major change here is the going from 8 of the 12 records for monthly monitoring to 10 of the 12 records. The group with input from states thought that that number should go up to represent the crucial nature of having these records that proves that the facility has been doing what they're supposed to on a periodic basis, more so than just the 8. So we raised that number here to 10 of 12 months. Charles, if you could advance the slide. Can you hit that? Thanks. Element C, as I mentioned, the electronic and mechanical release detection equipment, annual testing, at least annual for the federal requirements. It's periodic testing for SPA states. They have to ensure that the test was done on that automatic tank gauge probe, the sensors, that they are actually for the line leak detector, they're actually doing that test, performing or simulating that test to the 3 gallon per hour requirement, or more stringent if your state has established that. Element D, the containment sump for interstitial monitoring is captured here under the release detection. It is an O&M requirement, at least in the federal requirements under 280.35, but it's captured here because it addresses the interstitial monitoring of piping. As far as element C, that pretty much remains the same, where if there is a problem at the facility should have notified of a suspected release. I anticipate that this one will probably be somewhat problematic going forward. I know during the review of the regulations, a number of states said that for alarms, they were going to require that owners and operators submit those suspected release reports. For any of these requirements, if they go beyond the federal requirements, we definitely want to make sure that you let us know if you have more stringent requirements, so that we can make sure that if we're looking at these and perhaps you're tanking at maybe 10% compliance, we have a reason for that we could kind of backtrack and determine what the issue is. That's it for me for lease detection.
All right, so Tim mentioned that we have a inspector guide we also have some questions and answers. So on the final slide of this, there's a link to the OUST website where you can find those more detailed information about all of these measures and some questions and answers in case you have a question later. And the inspector guide really does go into quite a bit of detail on each of the measures. So thanks for mentioning that, Tim. So now we want to talk about, those were the measures that are included in the TCR. We have a number of other measures that we're going to be collecting information on. These, of course, are very important measures and information that we want to have about what's happening across the country. But we've decided, the work group talked a lot about these and whether or not they should be included in the combined measure. And we've decided that they will not be. So while we will collect those, these will each be separate. So these are operator training, financial responsibility, and walkthrough inspections. And we're going to start off with Tim talking about operator training.
So finally, after years of requests to capture or measure the operator training, it's here. It's a new requirement or new measure under TCR. And what this is, it boils down to two ways that we have kind of recognized as ensuring that this measure is done or that this is complied with at the facility. That can be done either through the on-site inspection, your periodic inspection, or through a query of your database. Both are valid, but for each one of those approaches, it's for the period of performance or for the reporting period. So if you're going out on site and you're requiring your inspectors to give an assessment based on the number of facilities that they go to during that reporting period, that can be provided to EPA for this measure. Or if you're running a query based on requirement that you have your owners and operators, whenever they meet the operator training requirements, they might have it online. I know a number of states, they have the web-based training, and you track it that way. Either way, it's for the reporting period. So that's it for operator training.
All right. So now Shoyi Risher of OUST is going to talk a little bit about the new FR measure.
Right. So this measures will start measuring compliance with financial responsibility to verify that owners and operators demonstrates FR. Part of this is, in order to do this, you have to verify that the wording of the FR documents are exactly the same as the language that's described in subpart H. You also need to verify that the owner's FR includes third-party liability and cleanup coverage. Make sure that the amounts are correct, and then you have to make sure that all the underground storage tanks that are registered or on-site are included on the FR documents. For insurance, you should verify that the policy provides the first dollar coverage and that there is no self-insured retention. Now, for first dollar coverage, if the insurance policy includes the certificate or endorsement that is worded exactly as listed in 280.97, then first dollar coverage is covered. As to self-insured retention, SIR, there's no real good way of verifying this unless you actually request the insurance policy and look through the language to see whether or not there is an SIR that's being put into the policy. In which case, if there is an SIR, then that insurance policy is actually only a partial FR mechanism, and the owner-operator would need to provide a separate FR mechanism to cover the SIR amount. So if there's any questions about SIRs or first dollar coverage, feel free to contact me separately from this call. That could take up a lot longer than, and not a topic of this webinar. So next slide. Now this measure is unique in that the measure is determined at the time of inspection or the review of the FR documents. So it's based on the initial document review, whether it's at the time of the inspection or whether I know some states have owners and operators submit the FR document separately so that they review it at a later time. But whenever that initial review of those FR documents is when that compliance measure is taken. So if the implementing agency is working with an owner to come into compliance after the initial submission, then the facility is still not in compliance. So that's how it is.
All right, thanks, Choi. So the last of these three new measures that are not a part of the combined TCR measure is walkthrough inspections. And again, we think it's really important to collect information, especially on these walkthroughs as a new part of our regulations, but we're not going to include that in our combined TCR measure. So for this measure, the inspector needs to ensure that the system is properly conducting both their 30-day and their annual walkthrough. So for the 30-day, you'll verify that the walkthrough inspection was conducted and that all spill prevention and release detection equipment were checked. This one, like release detection, we're asking that you verify that there are at least 10 months of records maintained for a year. We use 10 here to be consistent with the change that we made to the release detection measure. And you also need to verify that they conducted their annual walkthrough where they checked their sumps and their handheld release detection equipment. And again, for each of these measures, there's a lot more information in the inspector guide that Tim mentioned, so definitely worth a read. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sue Burnell of ALST, who's going to tell us a little more about how the reporting is going to work for these measures.
Okay. Hey, Liz, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Excuse me. We're into the home stretch now. So if you can move to the next slide, Charles, please. Okay. So Judy alluded to this under the FR, but this applies for everything. So that when in determining when compliance hits, it's when it's at the time of inspection. So with the exceptions are FR and operator training, there may be a separate agency review process that you use. So that is acceptable for the FR and the operator training pieces. So, and we know, excuse me, that the compliance measures are not the same as evaluating full compliance and enforcement. It really is a snapshot in time of compliance, and knowing that there are other requirements that you guys are still going to evaluate that are important parts of the program, but they're just not part of these performance measures. So states can continue to report on more stringent requirements than the federal regs. This was an issue that the work group discussed, and we determined that it was important to states that they could continue to report on more stringent requirements. As a note, so on the agency semi-annual report, we actually list the states that have told us that they are reporting on more stringent requirements, and the key phrase here is "they told us." So you guys need to let us know if you are reporting on more stringent requirements than the federal regulations, so that we can relay that information to the public, and that we know that when we're evaluating this information that you guys have more stringent requirements. So please work with your regions on that to share that information. So next slide, Charles. Okay, so one of the goals of this effort is to try and improve consistency of reporting where we can. Right now we see a real wide variation. We have everything from the 30s up through the high 90s in terms of SOC rates. So we're hoping that with reiterating that it's a these are all 12-month reporting periods. So even though you're reporting in Lust 4 every 6 months, for all of these new measures, except for the universe piece that Liz talked about at the very beginning, but for all of the new compliance measures, you're going back through a full 12 months worth of data when you're reporting. And then we also want to reiterate that when you're determining compliance, which is when you're walking on site and doing your inspections, or when you're first getting the submission of the FR materials to determine whether they're complete or not. So it's not after they've had a chance to fix it and then you're evaluating compliance. It's really when you've walked on site, what is the situation at that point. So, but we recognize that the purpose of reporting is to document what's happening in the states and not to try and change the way the state programs are being run. That's certainly, we're not trying to say you have to run your program differently in order to report these measures, but we just are trying to improve areas of consistency where we can. Sorry. When we look at the data, a lot of people say, well, I'm worried that, my number is at this level, and if you're comparing me to this state who has a different level, then I'm going to look bad, or I look too good, or I don't know if that's true for anybody, but what does it mean when I have different numbers from somebody else? And so we understand that there are differences between states, and we actually try not to do comparisons between states. What we are in-house are usually looking at is trends over time for one particular state. But, states are going to have, some states are reporting on more stringent requirements, others target inspections differently. So some years they're going to have lower levels because they're targeting non-compliant facilities. Others are different in details of inspections. Again, just to say, we're not trying to change the way your state is implementing its program with these new measures, but really just trying to be as consistent across the states as we can be, where we can. Okay, and finally, Charles, the next slide. Okay, so transitioning from SOC to the TCR reporting, plus the other new compliance measures. Again, these are continuing to be 12-month reporting elements. We've had a few questions about saying, well, the first time I report is not going to be 12 months, and we understand that. What you should be reporting is from the time when your new requirements are implemented. You will no longer report on SOC. You will start reporting on the TCR. So, for example, if that happens in January, you actually aren't going to report your October through December SOC measures. You'll only report TCR from the point when you began going forward. We're going to set up the system in such a way that you can only report SOC or TCR. So in that transition, we know that we're going to be lacking a little bit of data. We will probably ask for a comment in the comment field in Lust 4 to say how long, how many months worth of data do you have, or when did you begin tracking this information, so that we can better understand what we're looking at. But we're fully aware that we're going to go through a transition period here. So, and again, you won't ever report both an SOC and a TCR in the same reporting period. And just as a heads up, looking at the EPAC public record for when you're reporting on FY19 data, so it's not going to be the next year, but after when you're reporting on the year that the new regs are implemented, a lot of the public records actually refer to SOC in the statements about the compliance information, so that information will need to be updated as well. And then we will do specific Lust 4 reporting. We're aiming for winter of 2019 for that. We are working in Lust 4 right now with, we've made changes in development already to try and see how these new measures are going to look, and we will be working on testing that. So if you have a Lust 4 user ID and your password is still active, you can go into development and look at how those measures are laid out right now, if that would help you visualize what this is all going to look like. If you're interested in doing that, you can send me an email. My contact information is at the end of this presentation, and I can get you the link to it. If you have an old List for Development link, it won't work because every time they do an update to the system, it's a new link. So you'll have to contact me if you want to look. And then if there is a lot of interest in wanting to know what the system looks like before January or February, when all of the changes are actually in the system, we can actually do a webinar if you think that's helpful. So just let me know that as well. I think that's it, right, Liz?
Okay, so the final slide, thanks, Sue. The final slide just shows the link to the website where there are the question and answers as well as the guide for inspectors, and then also my contact information and Sue's contact information. So now I think we want to go ahead and open it up for questions, Charles.
Yes, I did get 4 in, so we'll go through these 4 first. The person who asked the question, I'll go ahead and unmute you just in case you had any follow-up or you needed to explain anything, so be prepared for that. We'll start with Chris Grinnell. He asked, regarding record retention, if the state requires that records be maintained for longer than the federal rule, should that state report compliance with state requirements? Release detection element C, for example. So I'll go back to that slide.
I guess this is Mark. I think this would apply not just to release detection, but in general. I think we may have talked about it after the question came out, but you're always allowed to report more stringent requirements. And if you do that, by all means, let us know, and we'll put it in the semi-annual report so people know that what you're reporting on is more stringent. And we also have an indication of what the requirements are that are more stringent. So if it's records retention or something else that's leading to some of the non-compliance, that could be recorded in our semi-annual report. So whether it's that requirement or any other requirement, if state has a more stringent requirement, it's easier or better for you to report on your state requirement, by all means, feel free to do that.
And that's the same as it's been under SOC and will continue to be the same under TCR.
All right, we will go back to 9C, corrosion protection. This is from Stephen Critchbaum. Should compatibility violations be included with Measure 9C?
We're all looking at each other.
I'd have to run back and look at that.
Matt, do you have it up? Corrosion protection system. Tim, go ahead. You're looking.
I was going to ask around the room. I mean, we could be talking about the sump corrosion issues. I don't think they were necessarily covered.
Yeah, I don't think it's covered here. Why don't we circle back and get Steve get you an answer specifically? But I don't think so.
Okay. And Steve, I had you unmuted if there's anything you wanted to qualify on that.
No, I'm fine with you getting back to me. I was curious about change of product, ethanol, biofuels. When we see problems, do we include them in any performance measure?
It's a good question. I don't think compatibility ended up in this list. Doesn't mean it's not important.
Right.
But we'll get you a final answer on that.
I'm going up to Sam Bassard. His question, if a state implemented secondary containment and interstitial monitoring per the EPAC in 2008, and these are not part of current SOC now, if we have not implemented new 2015 regs yet, do we need to note where we are more stringent with current SOC if we report secondary containment and IM violation?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that you have to. it's just an offer that we made. I think there was some concern. So just this taking us back to when we started the SOC many, many years ago, there were some states that said, we have our own regulations, and that's what we know, and that's what we report on. We don't want to have to maintain sort of a second set of books about compliance with the federal regulations. All we're focused on are our state regulations. So that's what we track and report on. However, since ours are more stringent, we're concerned that our SOC numbers are going to look worse than they otherwise would because it's a more stringent requirement. And that was how we set up the system originally, which is, by all means, report whatever is best for you to report, even if that's more stringent, but we make available the opportunity to identify where you're being more stringent. So if you look back at the semi-annual reports, I think there are 10 or 12 states that have identified that. But same as possible, you were have been doing that all along and just hadn't been noting that in the semi-annual report. You're welcome to do that now before all this transition happens, and we can include that in our next report. But again, it's an offer, but I wouldn't put it out as something that you're expected to do or have to do.
Right. Crystal Rodriguez asked a few questions, so we'll get a couple for you, Crystal, and I'll put you on mute too, and then we'll move on to a couple more and come back to you for the last one. First for Crystal, to meet TCR, how quickly must overfill CP be repaired after they are determined to have failed?
Oh,
yeah. So that's a good question.
That's a very, very good question.
Our regs, and I know some of you are different, but our regs don't identify a period of time within which they can return to compliance. It's kind of like you just have to do it right away. But we realize that's not practical. So, I think that has been, at the discretion of the state to determine that, or if it's an EPA inspector, the discretion to interpret that. So, I don't recall whether we addressed that specifically in any of this language, but my sense, this is Mark, is that you're going to be able to make that call. However, you would enforce that in your state. You could use that as a guidance. But those on the work group who want to weigh in, if there was a broader discussion about that.
Yeah, we did not address those, but I think we went back. I'm not sure if it was discussions with the work group or elsewise, but we looked at the original requirements for the regulation. It says release detection. So if you're storing product, you have to have release detection. If something's wrong with the equipment, you don't have release detection. So it's kind of immediate. All of our language for response to release, you get it fixed immediately. We understand, like Mark said, immediate in some cases can't be done, but if you don't have a delivery for a while, you don't necessarily need that overfill. You're not filling it, but once the facility fills, they have to have overfill protection. So you kind of gauge that on your enforcement discretion as to when you put the hammer down. So there's flexibility in the regulations about enforcement discretion. We have not established any time. I remember back in the proposed regulation, we have a couple of instances where we say it needs to be done immediately. We have requests to remove that language, but I'm glad we kept it because it is, you need to do it when you need it. So if you're storing product as a facility, you need release detection, so it's immediate. So hopefully that helps.
Okay, we'll go to Crystal's second question. For the FR requirement, must an insurance policy properly note the number of tanks versus compartments on the certificate of coverage? I've been notified that some insurance companies prefer documenting compartments instead of number of tanks, and this makes the records appear incorrect.
Well, that's interesting. That's a pretty specific question. We at EPA include a compartmented tank as a single tank. I know some of you do that differently, which is fine. If they were, I guess the more tanks the more tanks they cover, that I'm sort of thinking this one as we go, and maybe it's best not to do that. Maybe we should circle back with you on that. I don't immediately see a problem with that if they do compartments, but why don't we take that as another follow-up? If others are on the call have specific thoughts on that, feel free to join in.
All right, well, I've got everybody muted right now, Mark, so we can save that for the open dialogue, maybe.
Okay, fair enough.
And then we're going to jump to Elizabeth Vanderwerken. She says, or she asks, TCR must be implemented when new regs are implemented. What does implemented mean? Adopted or compliance dates passed?
Compliance, it means compliance dates passed. So you'll have for instance, the effective date of our regulation was in 2015, but you don't have to do your first test until coming up this October of 2018. So we would not expect you to be reporting on, if you have similar dates to ours, we would not expect you to be reporting until after your 2018 deadlines for testing passed.
Okay. And I forgot to unmute Elizabeth. Is that good enough to answer any response? Okay. I'm just moving down. We're going back to Crystal. Her third question: if the probability of detection for beta roots CSLD is incorrect because the default has been set, is that an NO for TCR or SOC?
Let's see, you're looking at a specific release detection method, CITLD, and it's not programmed properly to meet the requirements. Is it a TR? Yes, it is. That's has not met the performance requirements. It's not set up. I think that's what, 9A? Element 9A of element A of 9D. It does not meet the performance standards. It's not set up to do the appropriate test.
And that would have been true under SOC as well.
Correct, yes. Did that answer your question? Who has that?
That was Crystal again. Her mic's not working right now, so we can ask her to get back to us if it didn't.
Okay.
All right, I have no more written questions in right now. No hands are raised. I'll give people a few seconds. If there's anything you want to ask verbally, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, well, I'll turn it back over to Alice or any of the panelists. Do you have any closing remarks before we shut down?
Well, this is Mark. I just, and turn it to others, but again, appreciate your taking the time today to listen to this. There will be, at any time we make a change like this, there are bumps in the road, and we will figure them out as we go. If after hearing this, or looking through this more carefully, you have additional questions, Liz has her contact at the end of the presentation for sort of specific, as a point of contact for questions about the measures changes, and Sue's contact for sort of the LUS4 reporting technical questions. But I just, again, circle back to the appreciation for all the folks, most of whom didn't have a chance to talk today, but there are a lot of the state folks who are on the work group put really a lot of time and effort and energy into it. So thanks to all who helped with this. We will work our way through any of the growing pains as we go forward, but this seems to be a very good format for capturing kind of the next generation of compliance for the program. So kudos and thank you to the work group.